This was supposed to be just another documentary, another headline, another story for audiences to watch, react to, and then eventually move on from, like so many others before it. At first, everything followed that familiar pattern. There was anticipation, early buzz, and conversations building steadily in the weeks leading up to the release. Social media chatter hinted at what was coming, and fans speculated about what 50 Cent might reveal in this latest project. And then the documentary dropped. It hit audiences with exactly the kind of intensity people expected. But what happened next? That's what no one was truly prepared for. Because the moment this explosive documentary, tied to 50 Cent and centered around T.I., began gaining traction, the story didn't stay confined to the screen. It didn't remain just a piece of content that people could watch, digest, and forget. Instead, it spilled over into real life, reshaping perceptions, fueling debate, and challenging what people thought they knew. At the center of this evolving narrative were the women whose voices carried the emotional weight of the story. They were not mere background figures or secondary voices. They were the core of the narrative. Their experiences, their perspectives, and their emotions drove everything forward. And yet, after the initial release, something unexpected began to emerge. These women, who had already shared their stories on camera, began to speak again. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in subtle, deliberate ways that quickly caught attention. Their statements didn't just add to the documentary, they challenged it. They introduced new claims, nuanced perspectives, and emotional details that the documentary had either left out or reshaped. The initial release, which already felt intense and raw, suddenly seemed incomplete. What audiences had watched might not have been the full story. And as those statements circulated across social media, news outlets, and private conversations, people began to reconsider everything they had assumed. According to individuals close to the production, some of the women are now expressing that the documentary represented only a fraction of what actually happened. That realization hit hard, because if viewers already felt the footage was intense, emotional, and at times unsettling, then the idea that there was more, much more, raised serious questions. What had been left out? Why were certain moments excluded? Who made those decisions and on what grounds? Most importantly, what are these women now revealing that makes people reevaluate the documentary entirely? As the conversation grew, a pattern emerged. Some of the women indicated that their stories were not outright fabricated in the final cut, but they were shaped, adjusted, reframed, presented in a way that guided the audience's interpretation. Not false, but not fully complete either. And that distinction is crucial, because when real human experiences are involved, even subtle shifts in presentation can dramatically alter perception. A single emphasis here, a cut there, a softened moment. These choices determine how a story is understood and remembered. Now those same voices are stepping forward again. They are adding context, expanding on details, and in some cases, directly addressing what they feel was left out. This is no longer just about telling their stories, it's about reclaiming them. And the timing of their statements adds another layer to the intrigue. Why now? Why speak out after the documentary has already been released and consumed by millions? According to insiders, something occurred behind the scenes after the release that hasn't been fully disclosed. Enough, however, to push these women to break their silence. Enough to make staying quiet no longer an option. And that alone has added a new layer of tension to the entire situation. It suggests that the current wave of revelations is not random, not accidental. It is a reaction, a response to events or pressures that unfolded after the cameras stopped rolling. Before all of this unraveling began, there was the documentary itself, a project that generated conversation and speculation from the moment it was announced. Because when 50 Cent is involved, subtlety is not part of the equation. His reputation is built on impact, controversy, and creating moments that demand attention. That energy was evident from the earliest teasers, clips with dark, serious, deliberate tones that hinted at deep, emotional, and unresolved stories. At the center were the women. Their experiences and perspectives were not just included, they were the story. And when the documentary was released, it delivered exactly what it promised: emotional depth, intensity, and the kind of moments that provoke debate. Audiences didn't just passively watch. They engaged, discussed, and dissected. Clips of key moments spread rapidly on social media, highlighting segments where the women described tense, personal, and often challenging situations. But even in those early reactions, something unusual began to surface. While the documentary presented a clear, coherent narrative, it didn't answer everything. Certain segments ended abruptly. Other moments hinted at deeper stories without exploring them fully. These gaps did not go unnoticed. Some viewers paused, rewound, and questioned what they were seeing. Not loudly at first, but just enough to create a subtle awareness that there might be more beneath the surface, more that had not been shown. Behind the scenes, this awareness wasn't entirely unexpected. Documentaries dealing with sensitive, emotional subjects always involve editing choices. Hours of footage are condensed into a coherent story. Moments are cut, rearranged, and reframed to fit the narrative flow. That is standard practice. But in this case, sources say the concerns weren't just about trimming time or structuring the story. They were about framing, emphasis, and what was left out entirely. The presence of T.I. throughout the documentary added further complexity. Whether directly on screen or indirectly influencing the story, his role created another layer of pressure. This was not just storytelling. It was reputation management, perception shaping, and narrative control. When real people and lived experiences are involved, every decision carries weight. Every cut, every inclusion, every omission can shift how the audience interprets the story. At first, none of this reached the public in a significant way. The documentary was released, initial reactions came in, and the discussion seemed to follow the expected trajectory. Intense engagement followed by a gradual fading of attention. But then something subtle began to shift. One of the women featured in the documentary made a simple statement. Nothing dramatic, no detailed account, just a few words. There's more to my story than what was shown. That small statement changed everything. It reframed the conversation entirely. People weren't just thinking about what they had seen, they were now thinking about what they hadn't seen. That one sentence suggested that even a documentary designed to be thorough and emotionally powerful might not have told the full story. Once that idea entered the discussion, it spread quickly. Audiences began revisiting scenes, reconsidering moments, and connecting details in ways they hadn't before. Soon, others began to follow suit. A few women made posts on social media, offering fragments of insight, context that had been excluded, or clarifications to statements made in the documentary. Some pointed out that particular emotional responses had been trimmed for pacing. Others highlighted moments where their words had been shaped to fit a broader narrative that didn't fully capture their reality. The revelations were subtle but cumulative, each adding weight to the growing realization that the initial release was only part of the story. This ripple effect transformed the discussion. What began as a straightforward release had now evolved into a complex narrative puzzle. Viewers were no longer passive consumers. They became investigators, analyzing body language, cross-referencing statements, and reading between lines in ways that blurred the boundary between audience and detective. The conversation shifted from admiration or shock to scrutiny and interrogation. As more voices emerged, a pattern of deliberate shaping became evident. Editing choices had emphasized certain interactions, minimized others, and sometimes recontextualized statements to align with a particular storytelling arc. It wasn't malicious in every case, but the impact was significant. A single cut could make one moment feel confrontational, another seem subdued. One edited pause could suggest hesitation or fear where none existed. And these small decisions, accumulated over an hour of footage, shaped audience perception in ways that even the filmmakers may not have fully anticipated. Adding to the tension was the timing of the women's revelations. By coming forward after the documentary's release, they challenged the authority of the narrative. The public, who had already consumed the film, now faced the dilemma of reconciling what they saw with what was being revealed after the fact. Their words suggested that the narrative presented was curated, filtered, and in some ways incomplete. The documentary had not just delivered content, it had set the stage for controversy, dialogue, and ultimately, reconsideration. The women's voices, once filtered through the lens of the project, now emerged independently, reclaiming agency and reshaping how the story was understood. The tension was palpable. Social media platforms buzzed with debate. Clips were revisited, comments analyzed, and discussions deepened. The audience was not just watching anymore. They were participating, questioning, and challenging the narrative in real time. And that is where this story stands. Now, the documentary itself, while powerful, is no longer the definitive account. The women's ongoing statements have shifted focus from what was shown to what might have been left out. Editing choices, narrative framing, and the influence of high-profile figures like T.I. have all come under scrutiny. The audience is now aware that the story they consumed may be incomplete, shaped by decisions made behind the scenes, and that the voices of those at the center are still emerging, still evolving, and still reshaping the narrative. This evolving discussion has made one thing clear: stories are never just stories. They are living, dynamic entities, shaped by perspective, presentation, and the voices allowed to be heard. And in this case, the documentary, while initially seen as the final word, has become only a starting point, a trigger for deeper examination, broader conversation, and the realization that truth, context, and representation are often more complex than they appear. What audiences first experienced was intense, emotional, and thought-provoking. But what they are now witnessing, the women reclaiming their stories, adding context, challenging omissions, has elevated the conversation to a new level. The narrative is no longer fixed. It is fluid, contested, and evolving. And as long as these voices continue to emerge, as long as questions about what was left out remain unanswered, the story is far from over. It is a reminder that in documentary storytelling, the narrative presented is only a portion of the reality experienced by those involved. And for viewers, it is a lesson in scrutiny, awareness, and the importance of listening to voices beyond the final edit. What was supposed to be a contained, impactful documentary has become a living discussion, a story whose boundaries are defined not by what was released, but by what continues to surface. The documentary dropped, the reactions came, but the story continues. And as long as these voices are speaking, as long as questions remain, the narrative remains unfinished, dynamic, and in many ways more compelling than anyone could have predicted. What followed the release of the documentary was a gradual, almost imperceptible shift at first, a shift that soon became impossible to ignore. Initially, the documentary had been perceived in familiar terms, a finished product, polished, carefully constructed, and emotionally potent. It had been a headline, a story, a moment of attention in the cycle of media that audiences consume and then forget. But slowly, subtly, that perception began to change. The film was no longer just a finished piece. It had evolved into something else entirely, a starting point for a larger conversation, one that would question not just the events depicted, but the choices made in portraying them. The conversation wasn't simply about content. It was about control, about editing, about whose voices were fully represented and whose were filtered, softened, or partially presented. And as the days passed, as more voices began to emerge, the conversation grew louder, more urgent, and far more complex. The documentary had set the stage, but the real story, messy, complicated, and intensely human, was unfolding outside of the frames that audiences had initially consumed. Now, the story wasn't only about what had been shown on screen. It was about everything surrounding it, the editorial decisions behind it, the unseen pressures during production, and the voices that were refusing to remain silent. Each new statement from the women involved added a layer of tension, a new dimension to a narrative that many had assumed was complete. With every revelation, the complexity of the situation deepened. What had seemed simple, contained, and linear began to unravel into something far more unpredictable. The documentary was no longer merely a finished product. It was an evolving story, one that was actively being reshaped in real time, as if the narrative itself were alive, responding to those who had been at the heart of it all. The shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly. The moment the documentary ended, a strange silence lingered online for just under 7 minutes. Then, precisely at 6 minutes and 58 seconds after the final frame, the first voice appeared. Quiet, hesitant, almost apologetic in tone. The post was understated, a single sentence, barely more than a whisper across a social media feed. Yet it was enough. That single voice signaled that there were others who felt the same way. And just like that, the floodgates opened. In the following hours and days, more posts surfaced, each from a different woman, each with a unique tone, style, and cadence. Yet they all carried a consistent underlying message. What audiences had seen in the documentary was not the complete picture. Moments had been left out, context had been shifted, and nuances that might have changed the way viewers understood events had been quietly omitted. The narrative that had once felt closed, definitive, and polished was now revealed to be far from complete. What viewers thought they knew was now under scrutiny, and the conversation shifted dramatically. The documentary was no longer the final word. It had become the opening chapter of a much larger story. The real drama was not contained within the polished frames of the film. It was unfolding elsewhere, in unfiltered social media posts, in comment threads that stretched for miles, in personal statements that conveyed raw, sometimes uncomfortable, emotions. What had begun as a controlled narrative was now being contested in real time, and the more it expanded, the more intense the debate became. The central question changed as well. Initially, viewers had been focused on the events of the past, the moments captured on film, the stories being told, the recollections shared on camera. But with the emergence of new voices, the focus shifted to the present. Why were these women speaking now? What had finally compelled them to break their silence? And most importantly, what were they revealing that had been left out of the final cut? These questions transformed the conversation into something urgent, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. At first, the initial posts were interpreted as mild frustration. Perhaps these women felt misrepresented. Perhaps they believed that subtle but meaningful aspects of their experiences had been overlooked. Some observers hoped that these hints would pass quickly, that once the initial wave of attention subsided, the situation would settle into quiet reflection. But that hope was short-lived. Within 48 hours, the cautious hints had evolved into direct, unflinching statements. One post in particular sent shockwaves through the online community. It came from a woman whose segment had already gone viral, sparking wide discussion in its original form. This post was longer, more detailed, and far more pointed than anything that had come before. In it, she wrote, "What you saw was edited to make things look less serious than they really were." Those words alone reframed everything. The implication was profound. This was not simply about minor omissions or the trimming of extraneous material. It suggested that the lived experiences of the women had been significantly more intense, more uncomfortable, and potentially far more serious than what the documentary had presented. In the days that followed, viewers began revisiting the footage with a renewed sense of scrutiny. They rewound key segments, paused moments for closer inspection, and analyzed every expression, every gesture, every nuance in search of what might have been omitted. The scrutiny intensified when another woman stepped forward, this time delivering a raw, unfiltered video. Unlike the documentary segments which had been carefully edited and polished, this video was stark, intimate, and unrefined. There was no music, no cinematic treatment, just her voice, her words, and her emotions laid bare. From the opening seconds, it was clear that this was different. The tone was urgent, vulnerable, and emotionally charged. A tremor in her voice underscored the gravity of her message as she said, "I watched the documentary, and I didn't recognize parts of my own story." That statement landed with enormous impact. To not recognize one's own story implies significant alteration, segments rearranged, context stripped, emphasis shifted. The video continued, revealing that conversations she had expected to provide essential context had been entirely omitted from the final cut. These were not trivial details. According to her, they would have fundamentally altered how audiences understood the events. Social media exploded with comments, questions, and speculation. Viewers demanded answers. What had been cut? Why had crucial context been removed? Were the stories intentionally shaped to appear less severe than they truly were? The intensity reached a new level when she added, "There were things I said that never made it in, and those were the things that mattered most." The controversy moved beyond complaints about editing. It now centered on control. Who decides which parts of deeply personal stories are shown and which are withheld? In projects of this magnitude and sensitivity, such decisions are rarely accidental. They are deliberate, shaped by editorial priorities, production pressures, and sometimes external influences. And when such choices alter the tone and impact of a narrative, they raise urgent questions about trust, integrity, and intent. Amid the escalating tension, an unexpected twist emerged from an anonymous insider account. The person claimed to have been involved in the production process, offering a behind-the-scenes perspective that shook the unfolding narrative. According to this insider, the documentary had not simply been edited for narrative cohesion or time constraints. Instead, it had allegedly undergone multiple rounds of re-editing after initial cuts were completed. The stated reason: concerns about impact. The post did not clarify whose impact was being protected or what exactly was at stake, but it revealed one particularly explosive detail. Some segments had been softened before release. The internet erupted. The notion of softened content implied that original footage had been more intense, more raw, and more direct than what audiences ultimately saw. Suddenly, the women's complaints were no longer dismissed as isolated emotional reactions. Their narratives aligned with the insider's claims, granting credibility to their statements. Social media and news outlets were awash with speculation. Why had the content been toned down? Was someone attempting to shield particular individuals or institutions from scrutiny? Or was the broader audience being protected from a more unsettling reality? The implications were staggering. The story now appeared far larger, more complex, and potentially more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Adding yet another layer of complexity, a previously silent woman emerged. Her message differed in tone. It was calm, measured, almost eerily understated. She did not focus solely on omissions or cuts. Instead, she addressed the framing and presentation of her story. "I agreed to tell my story, but not like this. Not like this." The repetition added weight, suggesting that the issue extended beyond editing into the realm of narrative shaping and possibly underlying intentions. She continued, "There were conversations that happened off camera that matter more than what you saw on camera." With those words, the scope of the controversy expanded again. If the most critical aspects of these women's experiences occurred outside formal filming, during private conversations, informal exchanges, or unguarded moments, the documentary might not just be incomplete, it might be missing the very heart of the story. The on-camera material, however carefully edited, could only capture surface-level events, leaving the deeper truths invisible to the audience. As the controversy intensified, the public began to perceive the documentary in a radically different light. What had been consumed as an authoritative, polished depiction of events was now understood as a partial, mediated narrative shaped by forces beyond the camera lens. Every decision, what to include, what to omit, and how to frame each moment, was scrutinized. The audience became investigators, parsing subtle details, replaying clips, and comparing statements across multiple platforms. The discussion extended into forums, comment sections, and private conversations, where speculation and analysis blurred with fact and perception. The story had evolved. What had started as a structured documentary, designed, edited, and curated to tell a coherent narrative, had transformed into a living, dynamic debate. Audiences were not passive consumers. They had become active participants, piecing together fragments, questioning authority, and weighing competing claims. Each post, each video, each revelation reshaped the narrative, demanding new interpretations and raising uncomfortable questions about what had truly occurred. And yet, for all the revelations and debate, a core tension remained. The heart of the matter, the full context of the women's experiences, remained elusive. What had been left off camera? What had been deliberately softened, rearranged, or omitted? Why had some voices been filtered while others remained intact? These questions lingered, unanswered, casting long shadows over the polished final product. By now, the documentary was no longer just a film. It had become an ongoing story, unfolding in real time. Its narrative had expanded beyond what was shot, beyond what was edited, and beyond what was released. The women's voices, once mediated through the lens of production, now existed independently, shaping perception, demanding attention, and challenging audiences to reconsider everything they had been shown. And the more this story unfolded, the clearer one fact became. Documentaries do not exist in isolation. They are living conversations between the subjects, the creators, and the audience. The narrative that reaches viewers is only one layer of a much deeper, more complex reality. In this case, the documentary had set the stage for a discussion far larger than its runtime, revealing that control over storytelling is as much about what is left out as what is shown. The release, the reactions, the emerging statements, they were all part of a larger phenomenon. A single piece of media, initially designed as a complete narrative, had become a catalyst for transparency, accountability, and reclamation. The documentary may have delivered an intense viewing experience, but the real story, the one shaped by lived experiences, editing choices, and off-camera realities, was still being written. And until all voices were fully until all contexts were revealed, the narrative would remain fluid, contested, and unresolved. The lesson was clear. The documentary had never been just a story. It was a lens through which to view broader truths about narrative control, voice, and agency. It had become a living conversation, a conversation that continues to evolve, intensify, and challenge perceptions every day. What audiences first consumed as a single, polished film was now understood as only a starting point, an entry into a much more complex and ongoing narrative. This distinction was significant. Emotion and personal perception often shape the deeper meaning of events far more than bare facts alone. If the emotional reality experienced by the participants differed substantially from what the documentary conveyed, then the entire tone and impact of the film might be fundamentally misaligned with the truth. She did not stop at that general observation. She began describing certain moments as far more intense than they had appeared on screen, offering hints rather than full details, but making it clear that a great deal remained hidden beneath the surface. Then, in the middle of her live stream, came a revelation that seemed to come out of nowhere and dramatically raised the stakes. "There were things we talked about that were supposed to stay between us," she stated. The phrase hung in the air, forcing listeners to pause and absorb its full weight. The idea that certain conversations had been intended to remain private suggested an expectation of trust and confidentiality. It implied that participants had shared deeply personal or sensitive information with the understanding that it would not be made public, or at least not presented in a particular way. Now she appeared to suggest that this boundary may have been crossed. The immediate reaction online was explosive. Speculation ran wild. Had private conversations been recorded or used without full consent? Were off-the-record discussions incorporated into the final project against the participants' expectations? The controversy was no longer confined to technical editing choices. It had expanded into serious questions about professional boundaries, informed consent, and the ethical line between responsible storytelling and potential overreach. As these revelations multiplied, the public began asking even more pointed questions. Had all the participants been fully aware of exactly how their stories would ultimately be presented? Did everyone involved agree to the same overarching narrative framework? And were there moments during production where the distinction between legitimate documentary filmmaking and something more manipulative had become uncomfortably blurred? Although none of these allegations had been officially confirmed by the production team at that stage, the questions refused to fade away. They continued to gain momentum as more voices joined the conversation. In the midst of this growing storm, a subtle but powerful development occurred. While the spotlight remained fixed on the women speaking out, an old clip from the documentary itself began circulating again on social media. This time, however, viewers approached it with a completely different mindset. They were no longer watching passively as an audience. They were examining the footage like investigators, searching for clues in every gesture and expression. One particular moment that had previously seemed insignificant now drew intense scrutiny, a brief hesitation from one of the women before she answered a question. At the time of the original release, it had appeared to be nothing more than ordinary nervousness in front of the camera. But when viewed through the lens of everything that had since been revealed, that small pause took on new meaning. It began to feel less like simple anxiety and more like the visible sign of something left unsaid, a momentary crack in the controlled presentation. This kind of retrospective analysis intensified the overall atmosphere. It was no longer just about the new information being shared in real time. The emerging story was also about how previously overlooked details were now connecting in unexpected ways. Pieces that had once seemed unimportant or easily explained were starting to look like potential clues to a larger, more complicated truth. The more people revisited the documentary with fresh eyes, the more they found themselves wondering whether the film had ever truly been intended to present the full, unvarnished picture, or had it always been designed as a carefully curated version of events, one that prioritized a particular narrative over complete transparency. The entire situation had evolved into something far more complex than a simple debate over documentary techniques. It had become a broader examination of power dynamics in storytelling, the responsibilities of filmmakers toward their subjects, and the fragile trust that exists between participants and producers. With each new post, live stream, or re-examined clip, the original documentary receded further into the background as the real-time unfolding drama took center stage. What had begun as a polished exploration of difficult experiences was now being challenged, dissected. The story is far from resolved, and it has the potential to shift dramatically with each new revelation. Additional participants could speak out, raw footage could leak, behind-the-scenes details could surface, or other audio clips might emerge. Each of these possibilities carries the potential to reshape the narrative once again, transforming public perception and forcing audiences to reevaluate conclusions that seemed settled. The debate touches on essential questions: the nature of truth in nonfiction filmmaking, the limits of editorial discretion, the responsibility of creators toward participants, and the ethical boundaries of storytelling. For now, the tension continues to mount without clear resolution. The documentary, once perceived as a structured, polished exploration of difficult experiences, has become the center of a far broader conversation about transparency, power, and accountability. What audiences originally accepted as definitive is now in flux. What was once taken at face value is being questioned, dissected, and contextualized in ways the filmmakers may never have anticipated. And all of this is unfolding in real time, across multiple platforms, with multiple voices shaping the story. Importantly, this is not just a debate about one project. It serves as a lens for examining how documentary storytelling functions more generally. Real lives are rarely neat or easily digestible. Complex emotions, sensitive experiences, and layered realities often cannot be fully conveyed in limited runtimes or structured narratives. Every editing choice, what to include, what to cut, how to frame a moment, carries ethical weight. Even small decisions can have profound implications for how participants are perceived and how their experiences are understood by the public. The short audio clip encapsulates this tension perfectly. Its ambiguity allows for multiple readings, forcing audiences to confront the uncertainty inherent in storytelling. It prompts us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much control should filmmakers exercise over participants' narratives? How should creators balance clarity, impact, and truthfulness? And when participants feel misrepresented, how should their voices be amplified without undermining the integrity of the story? These are not abstract questions. They cut to the heart of documentary ethics and the responsibilities of storytellers when real lives are involved. Even as debates rage, one fact is undeniable: the conversation is far from over. The story is still evolving, and the next chapter could be even more revealing than what has come before. Every new statement, every leaked clip, every clarification or denial has the power to shift the narrative, reshape public understanding, and alter the perception of authenticity. The controversy has transformed what might have been a static, closed narrative into a living, breathing discourse that engages audiences not just as passive viewers, but as active participants in an ongoing debate about truth, ethics, and representation. In the meantime, the discussion belongs to everyone following it. Diverse perspectives are essential. They illuminate blind spots, challenge assumptions, and force a more nuanced understanding of both the documentary and the complex realities it seeks to portray. The story serves as a reminder that polished films are only one layer of truth. Beneath the carefully constructed frames lies a web of decisions, compromises, hopes, and sometimes disappointments, elements that rarely make it to the final cut, but which shape the reality of the experience being documented. The screen may have faded to black at the end of the film, but the real discussion is just beginning. Audiences are now engaged in a dialogue that the filmmakers may not have anticipated, one that examines not only what was shown, but why it was shown. Hat was omitted, and whose voices were prioritized or muted. Whatever comes next, whether official statements, revised editions, public apologies, or additional leaks, the questions raised by that single line of audio will likely persist. They force us to consider how we consume nonfiction media, how we interpret it, and how ethical responsibility intersects with the craft of storytelling. Ultimately, the clip is more than just a few words. It's a symbol of the broader tension between control and authenticity in documentary filmmaking. It is a reminder that storytelling is never neutral, that narrative is always shaped, and that the truth is often complicated, layered, and sometimes elusive. The documentary may have provided a window into a set of experiences, but the full picture, the one that includes the voices, context, and decisions behind the camera, remains unresolved. And until all elements are revealed, the story continues to unfold, challenging audiences, creators, and critics alike to engage with it critically, empathetically, and thoughtfully.